The late summer wind was a restless thing, a constant whisper across the Llano Estacado that carried the scent of dust and cured grama grass. It offered no relief from the heat that beat down from a bleached white sky. Only moving the warmth around, it spun the blades of the windmill with a rhythmic, weary groan that was the only steady sound for miles. Red dust, fine as flour, settled on everything: the weathered planks of the Harper ranch house, the leather of Joe Harper's saddle, and the brim of her hat. It clung to the sweat on her face and the back of her neck, a permanent grit under her collar. At 25 years old, Josephine Harper knew this land as well as she knew the heft of the Winchester carbine that rested in its scabbard by her knee. Her family had come from Ireland with dreams of green pastures, only to find this sea of sunburnt grass and endless sky. But it was theirs, and after her father's passing and her brother Tom's death, it fell to her to manage it. Some folks in Mesquite Bend talked, of course. A woman running a cattle operation, wearing canvas trousers and carrying a rifle as if she were born to it. Joe paid them no mind. Talk was just more wind, and it never mended a fence or found a stray calf. Her gaze drifted east, toward the faint, dark line that stained the horizon. The railroad. The Copper Star Line, they called it. A promise of progress that felt more like a threat. It was the railroad's hired regulators, their so-called self-defense squad, that had been involved in the clash a year ago. The one that took Tom. The marshal's report had been vague, a confusing account of a skirmish, of tensions running high. But Joe knew her brother. Tom was a talker, not a fighter. He had organized a petition with other ranchers, a formal complaint about the railroad surveyors rerouting streams and trespassing on grazing land. 2 weeks later, he was dead. The official story felt as thin as a shadow at noon. A sharp crack echoed from the direction of that dark line, followed by a quick succession of pops. Not thunder, gunfire. Joe pulled her mare, Dusty, to a halt, her hand resting instinctively on the stock of her Winchester. She listened. Every muscle taut. More shots. A chaotic volley this time. Then a deeper boom that vibrated through the soles of her boots. She squinted, seeing a plume of black smoke billow upwards, much thicker and darker than the usual locomotive exhaust. Trouble, the kind that had already cost her family too much. Caution warred with a fierce, protective instinct. This was her land, or close enough to it that trouble could easily spill over. With a soft click of her tongue, she urged Dusty forward, not at a gallop, but at a steady trot that ate up the distance without kicking up a telltale cloud of dust. She kept to the low ground, using the gentle swells of the prairie as cover until she reached the line of cottonwoods that marked the Piha Katu Spring. The trees were the only real green for miles, a testament to the life-giving water that bubbled up from the earth. It was a place her father had always respected, noting that it was old land, a place of significance long before any surveyor drew a line on a map. The smell of burnt metal and something acrid now tainted the wind. Dismounting, Joe ground-tied Dusty and moved forward on foot, her carbine held low and ready. The scene over the next rise was one of violent disruption. A Copper Star test train, just an engine and 2 cars, was derailed. The engine lay on its side like a great dead beast, steam hissing from its ruptured belly. One of the cars was splintered and burning. She saw bodies, still and silent, scattered near the tracks. From this distance, she could not tell who they were. Regulators, railroad men, it made no difference now. Her eyes scanned the area, searching for movement, for any sign of the attackers. There was nothing, just the wind and the crackle of the fire. But then she saw it. A trail. Not of a horse, but of a man, dragging one leg, heading away from the wreck and toward the spring, toward her. Joe flattened herself behind a cluster of mesquite, the rifle's wooden stock cool and solid against her cheek. She watched the slow, pained progress of a figure stumbling through the tall grass. He was Comanche. She could tell by the buckskins and the long, dark hair that fell free. He moved with a warrior's purpose, even when wounded, his focus entirely on reaching the sanctuary of the cottonwoods. He collapsed near the edge of the spring, pulling himself the last few feet to plunge his hands into the cool, clear water. Jo remained hidden, her heart pounding a heavy, deliberate rhythm against her ribs. Every story she had ever heard, every whispered warning about savage raids, screamed at her to stay put, or better yet, to leave. But she also saw a man, badly hurt and alone, seeking the same water that sustained her own cattle, the same water Tom had argued the railroad had no right to steal. Slowly, deliberately, she stood up. The snap of a twig under her boot was all it took. The man's head jerked up, his body instantly coiling despite the obvious pain. In his hand was a knife, and his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that burned away all thoughts of him as a victim. He was a cornered wolf, ready to fight to the last. "I am not here to cause you harm," Jo said, her voice steady, louder than she intended in the sudden quiet. She kept the Winchester pointed at the ground, a gesture of peace, however fragile. The warrior said nothing. He pushed himself into a sitting position against the trunk of a cottonwood, his left leg stretched out at an unnatural angle. Blood soaked his buckskin trousers from a wound high on his thigh. He was young, younger than her, maybe 22 or 23. A leather cord around his neck held a single, perfect hawk feather. "You are on Harper land," she stated, taking a cautious step closer. A humorless smile touched his lips. "This land has a name older than any Harper." He spoke English, his words clipped and clean. He shifted, and a sharp intake of breath betrayed the severity of his injury. Jo's gaze flickered from his face to the wound and back again. The regulators who killed Tom were white. The men on that train were white. The world was supposed to be simple, divided into clear lines of allies and enemies. But standing there, with the smoke of the railroad's burning car in the air, the lines seemed to have blurred into an incomprehensible smudge. "What happened back there?" she asked. "Progress," he said, the word dripping with sarcasm. He watched her, his eyes missing nothing, assessing her clothes, her rifle, the way she stood, poised and ready. "Your people are very loud when they claim the future." "My people," Jo's voice was tight. "I'm just trying to keep my cattle fed and my ranch solvent. That train is no friend of mine." This seemed to catch his interest. He tilted his head. "The Copper Star is no friend to anyone who drinks from this water. Rancher or Comanche." He gestured with his chin toward the distant wreck. "They were not attacked by bandits, not in the way they will tell it." Jo took another step closer, her curiosity now overriding her caution. Then what happened? Their own trap misfired. He looked down at his leg, his face a mask of pain. "Copper Star wants this land, all of it, especially this water. But the treaties say they cannot take it. So they create a new story. They hire men, regulators, to disguise themselves, to attack their own train. They will blame the Comanche. They will say the land is not safe, that we are savages who must be removed. Then they will present their own maps to the territorial government, maps that show this spring on unclaimed land, land they can then claim for their depot." The words hit Jo like a physical blow. Hired men, a manufactured attack, a lie to steal land. It was the same shadowy pattern, the same foul scent that had surrounded Tom's death. "How do you know this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I am Tsako. I am a scout for my people. I have been watching these men for weeks. They marked the land with new stakes, far from the old survey lines. I heard them talking. They planned this provocation today. I was observing from the ridge when something went wrong. They argued. Someone fired a shot. And then they all started shooting at each other. Fools. I was hit by a stray bullet." He looked directly at her, his gaze unwavering. "They will find me, and they will say I led the raid." Jo stared at him, the pieces clicking into place with a sickening finality. It was not a raid that killed Tom. It was a silencing. He knew what they were doing, and he had tried to stop them the legal way. with petitions and reason, and they had eliminated him for it. The story Lark told was not just possible. It felt like the undeniable truth she had been searching for. "My brother," she began, the words thick in her throat. "He was killed a year ago. He tried to fight the Copper Star over their land surveys. They said he was caught in a skirmish." Lark's expression softened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "There are many such skirmishes when the railroad comes," he said quietly. "Many good men die for stories that are not true." They were silent for a long moment. Two people from different worlds, bound by a common enemy. Joe looked at his wound. It needed to be cleaned and bound, or he would die here under the cottonwoods. She looked back toward her ranch, then toward the smoking train. Helping him was a risk, a tremendous one. If she were found with a Comanche warrior accused of attacking a train, she would lose everything. Her ranch, her freedom, maybe her life. But if she left him, she would be no better than the men who killed her brother. She would be accepting their world, a world built on convenient lies and brute force. She slung her carbine over her shoulder and walked to her horse, pulling the canteen and a small cloth bundle from her saddlebag. When she returned, she knelt beside him. He flinched, his hand tightening on his knife, but he did not stop her. "I need to clean that," she said simply, untying the bundle to reveal clean strips of linen and a small flask of carbolic acid. "It is going to hurt." "It already hurts," he replied, his eyes never leaving hers. As she worked, her movements deft and practical. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the cottonwood leaves, the prejudices she had grown up with. The invisible walls between their peoples did not vanish. They were still there, solid and real. But in this shared space by the life-giving water, a narrow door had opened. "I want the truth about what happened to my brother," Jo said, her voice low but firm as she tied off the bandage. "I want the men responsible to answer for it." Lark watched her, his face pale but resolute. "I want to protect this water for my people. I need proof of the Copper Star's lies, proof that will be believed by your judges." Their eyes met. There was no talk of friendship, no pretense of trust. What passed between them was a harder, more practical thing, a recognition of mutual interest, an unspoken agreement forged in shared loss and a common desire for justice. It was a temporary alliance, fragile and fraught with danger, a promise to walk the same path for a little while, because neither of them could walk it alone. The sun began its long descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and violet. The smoke from the train had dwindled to a thin, gray haze. Jo stood and offered a hand to Lark. After a moment's hesitation, he took it, allowing her to help him to his feet. The weight of what they were about to do settled upon them, as vast and as heavy as the darkening prairie. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth. For 3 days, they followed the trail of the lie, a series of freshly driven survey stakes that scarred the prairie. The wooden posts, raw and smelling of pine, were an offense to the ancient landscape. Tsako, whom Jo had started calling Lark in her own mind for the hawk feather he wore, moved with a limping but steady gait. He pointed out the subtle signs she would have missed the way the stakes deviated from the old, sun-faded markers of the official survey, a slow, greedy creep toward the Piha Katu spring. He showed her a partial map, drawn on crisp new paper, that he had found snagged on a greasewood bush near one of the stakes. It showed the spring located in a newly numbered parcel, labeled simply as Wasteland. Their alliance was a silent one, measured in shared tasks and watchful distance. He would find the path, and she would scan the horizon, her hand never far from her Winchester. At night, they camped without a fire, sharing her dwindling supply of jerky and hardtack. He never complained about the pain in his leg, but she saw the way he favored it, the tight set of his jaw when he thought she was not looking. She cleaned and redressed the wound each evening, her touch professional and detached, and he accepted her care with a quiet nod that was both gratitude and a careful preservation of his pride. They were two magnets, pushed together by a greater force, their natural polarities still resisting. The stakes and the map fragment led them south, toward the dusty outpost of Mesquite Bend. It was not much of a town, just a collection of adobe and raw lumber buildings huddled around a saloon and a general store, a place that existed only to sell overpriced goods to ranchers and extract wages from the railroad crews. As they rode down the single, wide street, a hush fell over the handful of loiterers on the boardwalk. Eyes followed them, cold and suspicious. They saw a woman in trousers, armed and astride her horse like a man, riding alongside a Comanche warrior. It was a picture that did not fit into their narrow, sun-baked view of the world. Whispers followed them like burrs. "That is one of them horse thieves," a man muttered, spitting tobacco juice near Lark's mount. Another stared at Joe, his gaze lingering with a mixture of contempt and crude curiosity. Someone ought to teach that one how to wear a dress. Joe's knuckles whitened on the reins, but she kept her face a mask of indifference, her eyes fixed forward. Lark seemed not to hear them, his expression as impassive as a stone carving, but she saw the subtle tightening of the muscles in his back. They dismounted in front of Nettie Gray's place, a long, low building that served as both a saloon and a supply store. A sign painted with faded letters advertised warm beer and dry goods. Before they could step onto the boardwalk, a man blocked their path. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a clean duster over a pressed shirt. A silver star was pinned to his vest, gleaming in the harsh sunlight. His boots were polished, and his face was clean-shaven, details that made him stand out in the grimy town. "That is far enough," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "I am United States Marshal Wexler. I will have a look at your papers." Joe met his gaze. "We are just here for supplies, Marshal." "Everyone in Mesquite Bend is just here for something," Wexler replied, his eyes moving from Joe to Lark and back again. "There was some trouble on the Copper Star line a few days back. An attack. Some folks are saying it was a Comanche raiding party." His gaze settled on Lark, hard and accusatory. "We heard about it," Joe said, her tone level. "We were nowhere near." "I am sure you were not," Wexler said, though his tone suggested the opposite. "Still, tensions are high. It is probably best if your companion here moves along. We do not want any more trouble." "He is with me," Joe said, the words coming out sharper than she intended. "And he is not looking for trouble." The marshal's eyes narrowed slightly. "A woman like you ought to be more careful about the company she keeps. It is a dangerous world." He finally stepped aside. "A clear dismissal. See that you get your supplies and move on. The law has a long memory in this territory." Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and smoked meat. A few grim-faced men sat at a table in the corner, their conversation dying as Joe and Lark entered. Behind the long wooden counter stood a woman with intelligent, dark eyes and hair braided with strands of silver. Her skin was the warm brown of the earth, and she moved with a quiet, unhurried grace. This was Nettie Gray. She nodded a silent greeting, her gaze taking in the situation without needing a word of explanation. Joe laid a short list of supplies on the counter. As Nettie gathered the items, flour, coffee, ammunition, and more bandages. She spoke in a low voice, not looking at them directly. "The telegraph line has been busy," she said, her voice a soft murmur beneath the clinking of cans. "Copper Star representatives are meeting with the territorial land agent tomorrow. They are finalizing a purchase agreement, a large parcel of so-called abandoned land that happens to contain a very reliable spring." Joe's blood ran cold. So soon? Nettie nodded, her eyes meeting Joe's for a brief, significant moment. "They have affidavits from the survivors of the train wreck. All of them swear they were attacked by a band of Comanche warriors." She paused, placing a box of Winchester cartridges on the counter. It is a clean story, the kind the law likes." Her words confirmed everything Lark had said. The trap had been sprung, and the jaws were closing. As Joe paid for the supplies, Nettie's hand brushed hers, her touch light but firm. "Be careful," she whispered. "The wind is not blowing in a good direction today." Nettie was right. As they stepped back out onto the street, the sky to the west was no longer blue. It was a sickly, churning wall of yellow-brown, a monstrous curtain of dust rising from the desert floor. A haboob. The wind, which had been a constant, hot breath, suddenly died, leaving an eerie, suffocating silence. The air grew thick, heavy with anticipation. "We need to find shelter, now," Lark said, his voice urgent as he grabbed the reins of his horse. The town erupted into a sudden, frantic energy. People shouted, doors slammed, and animals brayed in alarm. The wall of dirt and sand was moving with terrifying speed, devouring the horizon. The sun vanished, and a premature twilight fell over Mesquite Bend. A powerful gust of wind hit them, a physical blow that carried a blast of sand, stinging their faces and eyes. There was no time to think, only to react. The nearest solid structure was the livery stable. Joe shoved the door open, pulling her mare inside as Lark followed with his own horse. They slammed the heavy wooden door shut just as the full force of the storm hit. The world outside dissolved into a roaring, shrieking chaos. The stable was plunged into near total darkness, the air instantly choked with the dust that forced its way through every crack in the walls. The sound was deafening, a relentless howl that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. It was as if the world were being scoured clean by a furious god. The horses stamped and whinnied in terror, their eyes wide in the gloom. Joe spoke to Dusty in a low, soothing voice, her hand stroking the mare's trembling neck. Lark did the same for his paint, murmuring words in his own language that were soft and rhythmic. For what felt like an eternity, they stood in the roaring darkness, two solitary figures tethered to their animals, the storm their only companion. The artificial walls of prejudice and mistrust that had separated them on the open prairie were meaningless here. Inside this wooden box, they were equals, reduced to the simple, elemental state of survival. Slowly, as their eyes adjusted, the gloom resolved into faint shapes. Joe could make out the dark silhouette of Lark against a crack of dim, brown light. She pulled the canteen from her saddle and, moving carefully, made her way over to him. She held it out. He took it without a word, drank sparingly, and handed it back. She drank as well, the water tasting of metal and grit. She sat down on a bale of hay, the carbine resting across her lap. Lark lowered himself to the ground nearby, leaning his back against the rough wall of a stall, careful of his injured leg. The roar of the haboob was a constant, solid presence, isolating them completely. There was no Marshal Wexler here, no suspicious townspeople, no copper star. There was only the storm, the frightened horses, and the two of them. "You have seen a storm like this before," she said, her voice raised to be heard over the din. He nodded, a barely visible motion in the dark. "Many times, the desert breathes out. It reminds us who is truly in charge." They fell silent again. The shared moment of simple conversation, a small island in the ocean of noise. Joe found herself looking at him not as a Comanche, not as an enemy or a tool for her own quest, but as the man who had been right about everything. The man who was fighting for his home with the same fierce determination she felt for her own. She saw the feather tied around his neck, a fragile thing to carry into such a harsh world. And for the first time, she felt a flicker of something beyond a practical alliance. It was respect. He must have felt her gaze, because he turned his head toward her. He could not have seen her expression clearly in the dark, but his voice was softer when he spoke again. "This Nettie Gray, you trust her?" It was a statement, not a question. "I do," Joe replied. She sees things as they are, not as people want them to be. That is a rare thing, he said. The peak of the storm passed, the roar slowly diminishing to a mournful howl, then to a whisper. The profound darkness began to lift, replaced by a strange, sepia-toned light filtering through the dust-filled air. After a long while, the wind died completely. The silence that followed was as stunning as the noise had been. Joe rose and pushed open the heavy door. The world was transformed. Everything was covered in a thick blanket of red-brown dust. The air was still and hazy, the light muted and strange. Mesquite Bend looked like a town that had been buried and forgotten. They led the horses out into the quiet street. The shared ordeal in the stable had changed something between them. A bond had been forged in the dark, a silent understanding that they had faced the fury of the land together and had survived. They still stood on opposite sides of a deep canyon of history and experience, but for a moment, in the heart of the storm, they had stood on the same ground. The dust settled slowly, leaving the world muted and monochrome. In the eerie stillness that followed the haboob, Mesquite Bend looked like a forgotten relic. Joe and Lark decided to wait until the haze cleared, a silent, mutual agreement that moving in this strange, brown twilight was unwise. The town was a powder keg, and the storm had only dampened it, not diffused the explosive potential. A man appeared in the gloom, walking down the center of the street. He was not a townsman. He wore a tailored city coat, unsuited for the climate, and his boots, though covered in a fine layer of dust, were of expensive, polished leather. He moved with a stiff, military bearing, his back ramrod straight, his gaze sweeping over the town with an air of cold ownership. He stopped to speak with Marshal Wexler, who had emerged from his office, though they were too far away for Joe and Lark to hear the words. The dynamic was clear. The newcomer spoke, and the marshal listened, his posture deferential. The man's gestures were sharp, economical, slicing the thick air as he pointed east, in the direction of the Piha Katu Spring. This was a man accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed without question. Silas Vane, Lark murmured, his voice a low growl. Joe looked at him, surprised he knew the name. He is the head of security for the Copper Star. He was a cavalry officer before, fought in the winter campaigns. He does not see people. He sees obstacles to be cleared. Vane's presence changed the equation. He was the mind behind the muscle of the regulators, the architect of the railroad's brutal expansion. His arrival meant the timetable had been accelerated. They could not afford to linger, as if summoned by the thought. The door to Nettie Gray's saloon creaked open and a young boy darted out, running toward the livery. He stopped before them, glancing nervously back toward the saloon where Vane and Wexler were now standing. "Nettie says you forgot something," the boy said, his eyes wide. "Says you should come through the back. Now." They exchanged a look. It was a risk, walking back into the heart of town with Vane himself present. But Nettie was not a woman given to foolish chances. They tethered their horses behind the livery and circled around, slipping through a narrow alley that smelled of sour mash and old rain. The back door of the storeroom was ajar. Inside, Nettie stood among sacks of flour and barrels of pickles, her face etched with worry. "That man, Vane, he is here to finalize the land transfer," she said without preamble, her voice a tense whisper. "The land agent is due on the morning stage. Once those papers are signed, it is over. The law will be on their side, and they will have your spring." "We need proof," Joe said, frustration making her voice sharp. "Stories and suspicions are not enough." "I have more than that," Nettie replied. She reached under a stack of folded blankets and pulled out a thin, oilcloth-wrapped package. "One of Vane's regulators got drunk here last week. He had a ledger book, bragged about his bonuses. I could not take the book, but I sat up all night copying the pages I could. It is a record of payments to men for survey security, to others for disruption services. Your brother's name is in it. Josephine, a final payment noted on the day he died." Joe felt the air leave her lungs. She stared at the package as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. It was here. The connection, the proof, the start of a trail that could lead to Tom's killers. "There is more," Nettie continued, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded a second item. It was a piece of tracing paper, a map. This was tucked inside the ledger. "It shows the new survey markers, the ones that steal the water. It is a direct copy of the false map they intend to file." This was it, the kind of hard evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy. But before Joe could even reach for it, the world exploded. The storeroom door burst inward, splintered off its hinges. Two men, regulators with the dead-eyed look of hired guns, filled the doorway. Behind them in the alley, more were moving to surround the building. There had been no warning, no shouted demand, just sudden, overwhelming violence. "Give us the books. Nettie!" the first man snarled, his pistol leveling at her. Flames suddenly erupted in the main saloon, the bright, hungry orange visible through the connecting doorway. They had set the place on fire to create chaos, to cover their tracks. The smell of burning wood and whiskey filled the small room. Nettie did not flinch. With a movement as quick as a striking snake, she shoved the oilcloth package into Joe's hands. "Go out the window," she commanded. Then she did something Joe would never forget. As the regulator lunged for her, Nettie pulled a small derringer from her apron pocket and fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The man staggered back, a look of stunned surprise on his face, before collapsing in the doorway. That single shot bought them seconds. Lark was already at the storeroom's small window, smashing the glass and frame with the butt of his pistol. He scrambled through the opening, turning to help Joe, who clutched the precious package to her chest. As she climbed through, she saw Nettie standing her ground, a silhouette against the roaring fire, holding the second regulator at bay. They landed in the alley behind the saloon just as more of Vane's men rounded the corner. Gunshots echoed down the narrow passage, bullets chewing splinters from the adobe walls. There was no time to get to their horses. The street was a chaotic scene of shouting men and billowing smoke. Vane was directing his men with cold precision while Marshal Wexler was trying, and failing, to impose some semblance of legal order on the mayhem. "This way," Lark yelled, pulling Joe toward the street. Their only path was forward, through the heart of the chaos. And then Joe saw it, a mail wagon, its driver having leapt clear and fled the fire, the horses stamping and rearing in terror. A desperate, insane idea sparked in her mind. "The wagon!" she screamed. It was a leap of faith, a pure act of survival. Lark understood instantly. He provided cover fire, his shots deliberate and aimed, forcing the regulators to duck back as Joe sprinted for the driver's seat. She grabbed the reins, her heart hammering against her ribs. The leather was slick in her sweaty palms. She had handled plenty of teams before, but never like this, never under fire. Lark vaulted into the passenger seat beside her, just as a bullet tore through the canvas cover over their heads. Hiya Joe screamed, cracking the reins hard over the horses' backs. The team, already panicked, surged forward, the heavy wagon lurching into motion. They thundered down the main street, a runaway force of wood and iron. Men scattered before them. Marshal Wexler turned, his face a mask of disbelief and fury as he saw them hijacking federal property. He drew his pistol, but it was too late. They cleared the edge of town, the shouts and gunfire fading behind them, replaced by the pounding of hooves and the creak and groan of the wagon. Joe did not look back. She focused on the road, on keeping the terrified horses running straight and true. They were alive. They had the evidence. And they had just committed a federal crime. Miles later, when the horses were lathered with sweat and their pace had slowed to a walk, the enormity of what they had done began to sink in. Joe pulled the team to a halt in the shade of a rocky outcropping. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a bone-deep tremor in her hands. She was an outlaw, a fugitive. Her face would be on a wanted poster in every town in the territory by morning. The life she had known, the ranch her father had built, was gone. Perhaps forever. The law, the institution she had been raised to respect, was now her enemy. Lark sat beside her, his face grim. He reloaded his pistol with steady hands. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "There is no turning back now." "Josephine." "I know," she said, her voice hollow. She looked down at the oilcloth package in her lap. It held the truth about her brother's death, the key to saving Lark's land. But the cost of that truth was higher than she had ever imagined. The clear, simple lines of right and wrong had dissolved into a confusing, dangerous gray. To fight for justice, she had been forced to break the law. Lark's hand rested for a moment on her shoulder. It was not a gesture of comfort, but of acknowledgement, a recognition of the sacrifice she had made. "You chose this path," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "You did not run." He was right. She had not run, but in that moment, he was struggling with his own choices. He had seen her, a woman who had no part in his people's struggle, risk everything. He had brought an outsider into his fight, against every instinct, against the counsel of his elders. He had trusted her, and now she was a wanted criminal because of it. The weight of that responsibility settled heavily upon him. His war had become hers, and the burden was now shared. They were no longer just allies of convenience. They were partners, bound together by the fire they had escaped and the long, dark road that now stretched before them. They abandoned the mail wagon at dawn, taking only the horses and a few stolen supplies. Their path turned westward, away from the flat prairie and into the broken country that bled into the foothills of the Rockies. The landscape grew teeth. They navigated a maze of dry arroyos, the sandy bottoms littered with bleached animal bones and the skeletal remains of Ocotillo. The sun baked the canyon walls, and the heat was a physical weight, but the nights brought a startling, breathless cold. The moon was a stark, silver disk in a black sky, looking less like a source of light and more like a tightly stretched drum skin, silent and ancient. Coyotes watched them from the ridges, their yipping calls a lonely chorus that underscored their isolation. They were fugitives now, ghosts in a hostile land. The practicalities of survival stripped away the last of their polite distance. Their shared existence became a rhythm of quiet, necessary actions. In a steep-walled canyon, their path was blocked by a sheer rock face, a crumbling wall of sandstone too treacherous for the horses to climb. Joe saw it as a dead end, a place to turn back and waste a day finding a different route. Lark saw a solution. He calmly took his knife and began to trim long strands of hair from his horse's tail and from Dusty's. Joe watched, bewildered, as he deftly braided the coarse, strong hairs together, his fingers moving with practiced ease, forming a thin but remarkably strong rope. "This will hold," he said, testing the braid between his hands. "It is an old way." He showed her how to anchor it to a sturdy rock horn above them, how to use it not for her full weight, but as a handhold, a guide to find purchase in the rock. He climbed first, his movements fluid and certain, then coached her as she followed, her boots scraping for a foothold. She felt the surprising strength of the horsehair in her grip, a lifeline woven from the creatures that carried them. At the top, breathless and dusty, she looked back at the simple, ingenious rope. It was a piece of knowledge born of this land, a secret she would never have known. She looked at Lark, and for the first time, her respect was mingled with a quiet sense of wonder. Days later, their roles reversed. They came upon a deep chasm, spanned by a temporary trestle bridge built by a Copper Star work crew. It was a rickety, ugly thing of raw timber, and it was the only way across. A small crew of regulators guarded the far side, their presence a clear sign that this was a private road for the railroad's business. Lark was preparing to backtrack, to find a crossing that might take them days, when Joe stopped him. "I can fix this," she said, her voice low. She dismounted and rummaged through her saddlebags, producing a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside were several brass percussion caps, the kind used for setting demolition charges. Her brother, Tom, had been fascinated by the railroad's engineering and had explained their workings to her. "The work crews are careless," she said, holding one of the small, potent caps in her palm. "They leave these behind sometimes." Lark looked from the cap to the bridge, his expression unreadable. She showed him how to wedge the cap into a critical joint in the bridge's main support beam, how to run a long piece of twine back to their position. It was not enough to destroy the bridge, she explained, but it was enough to splinter the support, to make the structure unsafe to cross. No fire, no grand explosion, just a sharp crack that would send the guards running to investigate, giving them the time they needed to slip away. It was sabotage, clean and precise. He watched her, his focus absolute, his warrior's mind absorbing the lesson in this different kind of warfare. When she was done, they retreated to cover and she pulled the twine. The cap detonated with a sound no louder than a rifle shot. A key timber on the bridge visibly cracked and sagged. As the guards ran toward the sound, Joe and Lark were already leading their horses away, fading back into the wilderness. That night, they found a shallow cave carved into a rock face by ancient winds, a place that offered shelter from the biting air. The small fire they dared to build cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. The shared dangers, the mutual lessons, had worn down their defenses. They were no longer a rancher and a Comanche. They were just Joe and Lark, two people against the world. She was cleaning her carbine, the familiar, methodical movements a comfort in the vast emptiness. When she spoke, her voice quiet, they never found his body. Lark looked up from sharpening his knife on a whetstone. He waited, knowing this was not a casual remark. "My brother, Tom," she continued, her eyes focused on the rifle in her hands. "Marshal Wexler gave us a report, said there was a confrontation, that Tom was shot and fell into the canyon. They searched for a day," he said, "but they never found him. Not a trace." She finally looked up, and in the flickering firelight, he saw the raw, unhealed wound in her eyes. "My father died a month later. People said it was his heart, but I know it was the not knowing. We could not even bury him. We just have a stone with his name on it in an empty plot. How can you mourn someone when you are not even sure they are gone?" The silence that followed was heavy with her pain. Lark set his knife aside. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the dark. "My mother is buried by the Piha-Katu spring," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But the stone that marks her grave does not tell the real story." He looked into the flames, but Joe knew he was seeing something else. A memory from long ago. "When I was a boy, a party of settlers passed through. Their wagons were heavy, their animals weak. My people shared water with them from the spring. A week after they left, our people began to get sick, a terrible sickness of the gut that brought fever and death. It was the water. The settlers had camped upstream, and their waste, their sickness, had poisoned the spring that we had shared." He paused, the muscle in his jaw tightening. "My mother was among the first to die. I was not there. I was on my first long hunt, far to the north, eager to prove my manhood. When I returned, she was gone. My father told me she called for me. My guilt has been my shadow ever since. I was away, being a mighty hunter, while she was dying from poisoned water." He picked up the hawk feather that hung from his neck, his thumb stroking its smooth surface. "This was hers. I carry it to remind me of what I am fighting for. Not just the land, not just the water, but the memory of those we failed to protect." Joe stared at him, her own grief momentarily eclipsed by his. 2 stories, a generation apart, yet they were the same. A family destroyed by the carelessness and greed of outsiders. A brother lost to an official lie. A mother to a hidden poison. A daughter haunted by an empty grave. A son by a memory of his own absence. Their separate sorrows met in the firelight. two lonely ghosts finding a moment of shared understanding in the vast, indifferent wilderness. The next morning, they rode with a new purpose. The vulnerability they had shared had forged a bond stronger than any practical alliance. From a high ridge, Lark scanned the landscape below. He stiffened, holding up a hand for Joe to halt. She followed his gaze. Below them, nestled in a narrow valley, was a sight that did not belong a single, short spur of railroad track, ending abruptly at the base of a cliff. On the track sat a lone, solitary rail car. It was not a freight car or a passenger car. It was an office car, its windows dark, a thin trail of smoke rising from a stovepipe in its roof. "What is it doing all the way out here?" Joe breathed. "That is their headquarters," Lark said. His eyes narrowed with intense focus. A mobile office. Vane is not a fool. He would not keep the real documents in a place like Mesquite Bend. He would keep them close, the original survey maps, the land deeds signed under false pretenses, the real ledgers. Everything we need to prove our case would be in there. He looked at her, his eyes blazing with a fierce, new light. "The truth is in that box." Joe looked at the isolated car, a steel vault of secrets sitting in the middle of nowhere. Attacking it was madness. It would be guarded. It was a fortress. But as she looked at Lark, at the quiet determination on his face, she knew what they had to do. Their separate quests for justice, for vengeance, had led them to this single point. The pain of the past, the shared stories by the fire, had not been an ending. They had been a sharpening, a honing of their purpose. They would not just expose the lie, they would steal the truth right from the heart of the beast. The night they chose for the raid was moonless, the sky a black velvet cloth with a sparse dusting of cold, distant stars. A sliver of bone-white moon had set hours earlier, plunging the valley into a profound darkness. They left the horses hobbled in a hidden ravine and approached the solitary office car on foot, moving like ghosts through the sagebrush. The plan was a desperate whisper, conceived in the twilight and born in the dark. Lark, with his natural stealth, would take the roof. Joe, smaller and wiry, would go underneath. Lark moved first, melting into the shadows and circling the car. Joe watched him go, then took a breath and slid on her belly into the cold, greasy space beneath the carriage. The air smelled of iron and creosote. She could hear the low murmur of voices from inside the car, and the rhythmic snoring of a guard from a small tent pitched nearby. Every scrape of her boot, every rustle of her canvas trousers sounded like a thunderclap in the stillness. She worked by feel, her fingers tracing the cold steel of the undercarriage until she found what they were looking for, a shallow storage compartment, its lid secured by 4 heavy bolts. Above her, she heard a faint, almost imperceptible scrape. Lark was in position. She pulled the small crowbar from her belt. The bolts were stiff with rust and disuse. She had to put her entire weight into the bar to get the first one to groan in protest. The sound was horrifyingly loud. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, listening for any sign that she had been heard. The snoring from the tent continued, unbroken. She let out a slow, shaky breath and went to work on the second bolt. On the roof, Lark lay flat, a shadow among shadows. He watched the lone guard, a heavy-set man who sat slumped in a chair by the car's entrance, a rifle across his lap. The man shifted, his head coming up as the second bolt shrieked below. Lark's muscles tensed. He picked up a small pebble from the roof's surface. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it into the darkness on the far side of the tracks. It landed with a soft clatter in the rocks. The guard grunted, peered into the night for a long moment, then settled back into his chair, pulling his coat tighter against the cold. The diversion gave Joe the time she needed. The last 2 bolts gave way with a final, protesting screech. The heavy iron lid of the compartment swung down, hitting the gravel beneath the car with a dull, solid thud. Joe reached inside, her hands closing around the corners of a heavy, iron box. It was locked, but that did not matter. This was the prize. She began to wrestle it out of the compartment, the weight of it awkward and immense in the cramped space. The box slipped from her grasp, landing with a loud, metallic clang that echoed in the quiet valley. The snoring from the tent stopped abruptly. The guard in the chair shot to his feet, shouting, "Who is out there?" It was over. The game of stealth was done. Now, Joe Lark's voice was a sharp command from above. Joe shoved the box out from under the car and scrambled after it. As she emerged, the door to the office car was flung open, spilling a rectangle of yellow lantern light across the scene. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, a pistol in his hand. It was Silas Vane. A predictable move, but a foolish one. Vane's voice was calm, almost conversational, yet it dripped with icy contempt. From the darkness, more figures appeared, regulators armed with rifles, their barrels glinting in the lamplight. They were surrounded and standing beside Vane, his face a grim mask of official duty, was Marshal Wexler. Lark dropped from the roof, landing in a silent crouch, his own pistol already drawn. "Drop your weapons," Wexler commanded, his voice tight. "You are under arrest for the robbery of a United States mail wagon." "We are not here for the mail." "Marshal," Joe said, her voice defiant as she stood over the iron box. "We are here for the proof that Copper Star murdered my brother and is stealing land with forged documents." Vane laughed. A short, humorless bark. Brave words. "They will sound splendid at your trial." He gave a slight nod to his men. The world erupted in a chaos of noise and muzzle flashes. Lark fired first, his shot aimed not to kill but to shatter the lantern in the doorway, plunging them back into disorienting darkness. Joe grabbed the heavy handle of the iron box, dragging it with all her strength toward the cover of a shallow gully a few yards away. A bullet kicked up dirt by her feet. Another sang past her ear. Lark moved to cover her, his pistol spitting fire, forcing the regulators to pause. He was a whirlwind of motion, a deadly wraith in the dark, but there were too many of them. A rifle flashed from the side, and Lark cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain. He staggered, his left arm going limp. Lark Joe screamed. He stumbled, but did not fall, firing one last shot before turning toward her. "The box. Josephine, get the box." She would not leave him. She grabbed his good arm, heaving him toward the gully as she continued to drag the iron chest. They tumbled over the edge, landing in a heap on the loose rock and sand of the dry wash, just as a volley of bullets tore through the air where they had been. They were out of the direct line of fire, but they were trapped. They lay there for a moment, gasping for air, the shouts of Vane and Wexler echoing from above. Joe could hear them organizing, preparing to sweep the gully. They had seconds. She pulled Lark deeper into the wash, which twisted and turned, offering temporary concealment. His breathing was ragged, and she could feel the warm stickiness of blood through his sleeve. The next day, a new wanted poster appeared in Mesquite Bend and every other settlement connected by telegraph. It featured both their names. The charges had been upgraded. No longer just wanted for questioning. They were now fugitives from federal justice, accused of armed robbery of government property and assault on a United States Marshal. Beneath their names, in bold letters, it read, "Armed and extremely dangerous." The poster had its intended effect. The simmering tension in the territory boiled over. Doors that had once been open were now locked. Faces that had been neutral were now hostile. In Mesquite Bend, someone nailed a crude, hand-painted sign to a post outside the burned-out shell of Nettie Gray's saloon. It read simply, "No Indians. No women with guns." Vane's lie was taking root, choking out whatever sympathy might have existed for their cause. They found refuge in a narrow crevice between towering rock formations, a place that felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. The iron box, their only hope, sat between them, a cold, silent testament to the price of their flight. Lark's wound was not a clean shot. The bullet had torn a fiery line across the top of his shoulder and through the thick muscle of his upper arm. It was not fatal, but it was bleeding badly, and the risk of infection in this wilderness was a death sentence in itself. Jo tore a strip from her own shirt. She washed the wound as best she could with the last of their clean water and a splash of whiskey from Lark's flask. He sat rigid against the rock wall, his face pale, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. He did not make a sound, but she saw the tremor in his good hand, the tight clenching of his jaw. "I have to sew it closed," she said, her voice flat and businesslike, betraying none of the fear churning in her stomach. She pulled a small sewing kit from her saddlebag, the one she used for mending canvas and leather. The needle was coarse, the thread thick. She threaded the needle, her hands surprisingly steady. "This will be bad," she whispered. He only nodded, his eyes closing. In the close confines of their hiding place, every barrier of custom and caution dissolved. She had to lean in close, her body pressed against his to get the right angle. She could feel the heat of his skin, the ragged rhythm of his breathing. The air was thick with the scent of blood, sweat, and the undeniable presence of him. As she pushed the needle through his skin for the first time, his entire body went rigid, a low hiss of pain escaping his lips. She worked quickly, her focus absolute, each stitch a small, desperate prayer. When she was finished, her hands were trembling. She tied off the last stitch, her face just inches from his. His eyes opened. In their dark depths, she saw not just pain, but a raw, unguarded vulnerability that mirrored her own. The world outside, with its pauses and its lies, ceased to exist. There was only this small, quiet space, and the powerful, unspoken thing that had grown between them in the fire and the dust. She raised a hand to brush a stray lock of hair from his forehead, a simple gesture that felt momentous, irreversible. Her fingers lingered on his skin. He did not pull away. He leaned into her touch, a silent surrender. She saw the question in his eyes, the same question that was screaming in her own heart. It would be so easy to close the final distance, to find a moment of solace, of oblivion, in his arms. But as she leaned closer, his good hand came up, not to push her away, but to gently catch her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Not like this, Josephine," he whispered, his voice hoarse with pain and something else, something deeper. "Not when we are running for our lives. It would not be right." She understood. What was between them was too real, too important to be born of desperation in a rocky crevice. It deserved more. It deserved a future, a sunrise, a world where they were not being hunted. She did not pull her hand away. Instead, she covered his hand with her own, her fingers lacing through his. It was not the touch of a lover. Not yet. It was the touch of a partner, a comrade. It was a silent vow, a promise made in blood and shadow, to see this through to the end, together. They moved for 2 days, pushing deeper into the high, cold country. The landscape was a brutal masterpiece of rock and wind, a place that had no patience for weakness. Lark's shoulder was a constant, throbbing agony, though he did his best to hide it, his movements stiff but measured, his face a stoic mask. Jo watched him, her own exhaustion a dull ache in her bones. The iron box was a cruel burden. They took turns securing it to one of the saddles, its dead weight a constant reminder of the life they had stolen and the one they were trying to reclaim. They made camp on a high mesa, a flat table of rock that offered a commanding view of the surrounding territory. There was no cover, but up here they could see anyone coming from miles away. The wind was a knife, sharp and relentless, cutting through their clothes. Lark insisted on taking the first watch, positioning himself near the edge of the mesa, his rifle across his knees, a solitary figure against the vast, bruised twilight. Jo saw the way he favored his wounded arm, the subtle winces he could not quite conceal as he settled himself on the cold stone. She went about her tasks, tending to the horses, checking their meager supplies, her frustration mounting with his stubborn pride. Finally, she walked over to him, a tin cup of lukewarm coffee in her hand. "Here," she said, her voice devoid of pleasantry. "Drink this." He took it with his good hand, his eyes never leaving the darkening horizon. "Thank you." "You are a terrible liar. You know that," she said, sitting down a few feet away. "You are about as subtle as a rock slide, trying to pretend that shoulder is not on fire." A faint smile touched his lips, but he did not look at her. "A warrior does not complain." "That is the stupidest thing I have ever heard," she retorted, the words sharper than she intended. "A warrior does not let pride get him killed, either. You need to rest. I will take the watch." "You have been in the saddle as long as I have," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You need rest, too. I am not the one with a hole in my arm stitched together with saddle thread." She shot back. She sighed, the frustration giving way to a weary sort of tenderness. She saw him for what he was, a young man, shouldering a heavy burden, trying to be the unbreachable wall his people needed him to be. She was pushing back not just for his sake, but for hers. She could not afford for him to fail. "Look, Lark, you do not have to be made of stone for my benefit. I have seen you bleed. The performance is unnecessary." He finally turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the deepening gloom. "It is my duty to protect you." The words, meant to be honorable, struck a spark of indignation in her. After everything they had been through, the fire, the storm, the gunfight, he still saw her as someone who needed protection. The old patterns of the world were hard to break. A wry, tired smile touched her own lips. "I ain't no lady," she said, the words a soft challenge in the wind. It was half a joke, a jab at the world's expectations, and half a plain statement of fact. The tension in his shoulders seemed to dissolve. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and a slow, genuine laugh escaped him. It was a surprising sound in that lonely place, warm and real. The sound of a barrier finally crumbling. "Good," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "That is what I came for, Darlin." The word, "Darlin," hung in the air between them. It was not the condescending term a cowhand might use. Coming from him, after that laugh, it was something else entirely. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance, a seal on their unlikely partnership. She was not the fragile creature his world or hers expected her to be, and he was glad of it. In that moment, the last of the distance between them evaporated, blown away by the cold wind. She took the first watch. He slept, a deep, exhausted sleep that told her how much pain he had been hiding. She sat with her rifle, watching the stars glitter like chips of ice, the weight of their new plan settling upon her. They had talked it out before he rested, their voices low and urgent by the dying embers of a tiny, smokeless fire. The iron box was their only leverage, but it was useless as long as it was locked. "We cannot just break it open," Joe had argued. "The papers inside could be damaged. We need a locksmith, or at least a blacksmith with a delicate touch." "There is no one we can trust, not in any of these railroad towns," Lark had countered. "Vane's reach is long." Their destination had to be Santa Fe. It was the territorial capital, a bigger, more complicated place than the dusty outposts they had been navigating. There would be law there, but it would be a more formal, less personal kind of law than Marshal Wexler's brand of convenient justice. "I have heard of a judge there," Lark said, his voice a low murmur. "Judge Caldwell. An old man, appointed from back east. They say he is hard, but he follows the letter of the law to a fault. He does not like the railroad, but he dislikes vigilante justice even more. He will not help us unless we bring him something undeniable." "We have the ledger pages from Nettie, and whatever is in this box," Joe said. "It is not enough," Lark insisted, his good hand tracing the edge of the iron chest. Vane will say the ledger is a forgery. He will claim we stole a box of private company papers. We need more. We need a witness, someone who can explain what the documents mean. He looked at her, his gaze intense. When I was scouting the survey crews, I heard the men talk. They spoke of an engineer who quit, argued with the foreman, and walked off the job. A man named Ojo Blanco. They said he was the one who drew the first false maps, that he had a crisis of conscience, if we could find him, if he would testify. The name, Ojo Blanco, wide-eye, hung in the air. A ghost, a conscience in the machine. Finding a missing engineer in the vastness of the territory seemed like an impossible task. But it was the only task that mattered. Their new plan was desperate: get to Santa Fe, find a way to open the box without destroying its contents, and find the man called Ojo Blanco. A cold drizzle began to fall. A fine, misting rain that was not enough to wash the dust away, but more than enough to chill them to the bone. It hissed on the embers of their fire, extinguishing the last of the warmth. The horses, tied nearby, shivered under a makeshift lean-to Joe had fashioned from a ground tarp. The temperature plummeted. Lark stirred, woken by the cold. He was shivering, his teeth chattering softly. Joe looked at their meager supplies. They had one thick wool blanket between them. To survive the night without freezing, there was only one choice. She did not hesitate. Practicality had long since replaced propriety. She sat down beside him, her back against the same rock, and draped the blanket over both of them. She could feel the shivers that racked his body. Without a word, she shifted closer, pulling the edges of the blanket tight, creating a small pocket of shared warmth. It was a deeply intimate act, born of pure necessity. He was stiff at first, his muscles tense, but as the warmth slowly seeped into him, he relaxed, his breathing deepening. The rain pattered softly on the rocks around them. The air smelled of wet sagebrush and dust. Under the rough wool, she was acutely aware of him. The solidness of his uninjured shoulder against hers, the quiet rhythm of his breathing, the faint, earthy scent of him. She checked the crude stitches on his arm. They were holding. There was no sign of fever. Not yet. He was not asleep. She knew it. He was as aware of her as she was of him. But neither of them spoke. There were no words for this moment, for the simple, profound comfort of another human being's presence in the face of the cold, the dark, and the threat of death. It was not passion. It was something quieter, deeper. It was trust, made tangible in the shared space beneath a single blanket. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but just to feel it, to feel this fragile warmth, this temporary peace, before the sun rose and they had to start running again. Santa Fe was a city of baked earth and brilliant color, a world away from the stark solitude of the high country. The central plaza was a river of people, Spanish women in black shawls, Pueblo artisans selling turquoise and pottery, dusty cowboys, and uniformed territorial soldiers moving with an air of detached authority. The air smelled of roasting chilies, horse manure, and the dry, ancient dust of the adobe buildings. They arrived looking like what they were, trail-worn and desperate. To blend in, they became invisible. Jo traded her trousers for a drab, patched skirt and a rough cotton blouse, carrying 2 empty water buckets to complete the illusion of a hired girl going about her chores. Lark bought a cheap, broad-brimmed felt hat that he pulled low, shadowing his face and concealing his long hair. They moved through the crowd separately, never speaking, their eyes constantly scanning, searching. Their first stop was the office of Judge Alastair Caldwell. The building was cool and dark inside, a formal, orderly space that felt like a different country. The judge himself was a man carved from old, dry wood. He had thin, white hair, spectacles perched on his nose, and eyes the color of a winter sky. He listened to their story, or the parts of it they dared to tell, without interruption. His hands steepled before him on a large, mahogany desk. They presented him with Nettie's copied ledger pages. He examined them briefly, then pushed them back across the desk. "This is an interesting narrative. Young lady," he said, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. "But it is hearsay. These pages are copies, inadmissible without the original. The testimony you offer is that of a wanted fugitive. The iron box you speak of is stolen property." "But the documents inside," Jo began, her voice pleading. "The contents of a stolen box are the fruit of a poisoned tree. In the eyes of the law," the judge said, his tone final. "I am a man of the law, not a dispenser of frontier justice. I cannot and will not act on speculation and stolen evidence. Bring me a sworn witness, a technical expert who can attest to the fraudulent nature of the Copper Star surveys, and I will convene a hearing. Until then, my hands are tied." He looked over his spectacles at Lark. "And I would advise you, sir, to keep that hat on. This is a lawful town." They left his office with the cold weight of the law settled upon them. The box was useless. Nettie's sacrifice was in vain. Unless they could find Ojo Blanco. Their search led them to the sprawling market on the edge of the city, a place where information was traded as readily as corn and blankets. It was there, in the shade of a long portal, that Lark found the man he was looking for. He was an old Cheyenne man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his long, white hair in two thin braids. He sat on a colorful blanket, not selling anything, but simply watching the world go by. Lark approached him alone. "Coyote Bill," he said, his voice low and respectful. The old man's eyes, bright and sharp as a hawk's, focused on him. A slow smile of recognition spread across his face. "Tsako, it has been many seasons. Your father's son walks a hard path. I see." "I need to find a man," Lark said, sitting cross-legged on the ground before him, an engineer who worked for the railroad. "He is called Ojo Blanco." Coyote Bill's smile faded. "That is a name that carries trouble with it. Why do you seek him?" "He carries a truth that my people, and this woman I travel with, desperately need." The old man was silent for a long time, his gaze distant. "You pulled my grandson from a frozen river when the ice broke on the Cimarron," he said at last. "A life debt is not a small thing. I will ask. I will listen to the wind. Stay out of sight. The men with shiny boots and silver stars have been asking about you too." For 2 days, they lived in the shadows, buying food from street vendors, sleeping in a crumbling, abandoned stable, the iron box their constant, heavy companion. The waiting was a torment. On the 3rd day, as Jo was returning from the public well, her buckets heavy with water, it happened. "Josephine Harper." The voice cut through the noise of the plaza, sharp and authoritative. She froze, her heart seizing in her chest. Marshal Wexler stood 10 feet away, flanked by 2 territorial soldiers. He held a piece of paper in his hand. A warrant. "You are under arrest for the theft of a United States mail wagon," Wexler announced, his voice carrying, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. "You will come with us peacefully." The world narrowed to the space between them. She saw Lark, standing in the shadow of an archway across the plaza, his hand moving toward his pistol. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. If he drew his weapon, he would be cut down in seconds. This was a trap, and it had been perfectly sprung. It was a legal move, clean and undeniable. They had caught her, alone, on a charge that had nothing to do with the railroad, a charge she could not deny. "It is over, Lark," she called out, her voice surprisingly steady. "Do not do this. It is my fight." She wanted to surrender, to take the fall and leave him free to continue the search. It was the only logical move. Wexler smiled, a cold, triumphant twist of his lips, a wise decision. But Lark did not stay in the shadows. He stepped out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight, pulling the felt hat from his head, letting his long, dark hair fall free. He walked toward them, his movements calm and deliberate. His eyes locked on Wexler. The crowd in the plaza parted before him, a current of murmurs and whispers following in his wake. "Her fight is my fight now," Lark said, his voice clear and resonant, carrying across the silent plaza. "If you arrest her, you arrest me." Wexler's face hardened. This complicated things. An arrest of a known Comanche warrior in the middle of Santa Fe was a much messier proposition. Before he could respond, a figure pushed through the crowd. It was Coyote Bill. "The man you seek," the old Cheyenne said, his voice urgent, directed at Lark but loud enough for Joe to hear. "I have found him, but he is not what you expect." At that moment, another man followed Coyote Bill out of the crowd. He was gaunt, his clothes worn, his face shadowed by a week's growth of beard. He looked like he had been living on the run for a long time. There was a hunted look about him, a deep-seated shame in his eyes. One of those eyes was a pale, milky blue, a startling contrast to the other brown one, ojo blanco. Joe stared at him, a cold dread mixing with a dizzying sense of confusion. There was something familiar in the way he stood, in the line of his jaw beneath the beard. Her water bucket slipped from her numb fingers, crashing to the ground, the water spreading in dark pools on the thirsty adobe dust. The man's gaze found hers, his face, already pale, turned ashen, his lips parted, and a single, choked word escaped. "Joe?" The world stopped spinning. The crowd, Wexler, the soldiers, they all faded into an indistinct blur. It was his voice, older, rougher, broken by hardship, but it was the ghost she had been chasing, the brother she had mourned, the man whose death had set her on this impossible path, was standing before her. "Tom," she whispered, the name a fragile, impossible thing on her tongue. Her brother, Tom Harper, took a stumbling step toward her, his face a canvas of agony and guilt. "They made me do it. Joe," he choked out, his voice breaking. "They said they would kill you, kill Pa. They had me cornered. I drew the maps. I moved the markers." He looked at Lark, a profound, soul-deep shame in his eyes. "I helped them steal this man's water. I helped them create the lie that killed me." He let out a dry, ragged sob. "I have been running ever since." The public confession of a man believed dead, accusing a powerful corporation and a United States Marshal of conspiracy and murder, could not be ignored. The Santa Fe Plaza, moments before a stage for a simple arrest, became an impromptu court of public opinion. Judge Caldwell, his face a granite mask of judicial fury, saw the explosive potential. He raised his hands for silence, his dry voice cutting through the stunned murmurs. "This matter will be addressed immediately, not in the street, but with due process. The town hall will serve as a venue for a preliminary hearing. Marshal Wexler, you and your soldiers will provide security. Everyone else who wishes to bear witness may attend." The town hall was a large, cavernous adobe building, and it filled quickly. The air grew thick and heavy with the heat of too many bodies, the scent of dust, sweat, and simmering tension. Joe, Lark, and Tom stood before a simple wooden table, facing Judge Caldwell, who sat elevated behind a heavy desk. On the other side of the room stood Silas Vane, his expression one of bored irritation, as if this were all a tiresome bureaucratic delay. Beside him, Marshal Wexler looked deeply uncomfortable, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, his eyes darting nervously around the crowded room. The iron box sat on the floor between the two groups. A silent, locked witness. "Mr. Harper," Judge Caldwell began, his voice echoing in the silent hall. "You have made some extraordinary claims. The court will hear them now. Speak the truth as you know it." Tom took a deep, shuddering breath. He looked not at the judge, but at the townspeople, the anonymous faces that made up the community he had wronged. "My name is Thomas Harper," he began, his voice cracking but gaining strength with each word. "I was an engineer for the Copper Star Railroad. I was hired to survey the new line through the Llano. At first, the work was honest, but then I was given new orders, directly from Mr. Vane." He pointed a trembling finger at the security chief. "He ordered me to create a second set of maps, a second set of survey markers. These new surveys illegally moved the boundaries of the railroad's land grant, annexing the Piha-Katu Spring and the surrounding grazing lands. It was fraud. It was theft, on a massive scale." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. "I refused," Tom continued, his voice rising with remembered anguish. "I told him it was illegal. He showed me a telegraph. It had a report on my family, my father's health, my sister, Jo, running the ranch alone. He made it clear they were vulnerable. He said if I did not comply, they would suffer. Accidents happen on the frontier. He said, so I did it. I drew the maps. I hammered the false stakes into the ground myself. The guilt was eating me alive." He paused, his gaze finding Joe's. "I tried to make it right. I organized a petition with the other ranchers. That was my mistake. It showed Vane I could not be controlled. The night after the petition was sent, his regulators came for me. They were not there to talk. They shot me. I fell into a ravine. They thought I was dead. I played dead, and then I ran. I became Ojo Blanco, a ghost, hiding in the shadows. Too ashamed to go home, too afraid to come forward." His confession ended in a choked sob, the sound of a man breaking completely. "Lies and fantasy," Vane said coolly, addressing the judge. "The ravings of a disturbed man. This is a pathetic attempt to deflect from their own crimes." "Then perhaps you can explain these," Judge Caldwell said, holding up the copied ledger pages Nettie had provided. "Payments to your regulators for disruption services. A final payment logged to a T. Harper on the date he allegedly died." Wexler shifted his weight, his face paling. He was implicated, his name on the list for receiving cooperation stipends. Vane's eyes narrowed to slits. He had underestimated the old judge. His calm demeanor finally cracked, revealing the viper beneath. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to one of his men standing near the back of the hall. It happened in an instant. A glint of sunlight from a high window on the far side of the plaza. The sharp, flat crack of a high-powered rifle. A woman in the crowd screamed. Tom flinched, but he was not the target. Coyote Bill, who had been standing just behind Lark, suddenly grunted, a deep, guttural sound. He took a step forward, a dark stain blossoming on the front of his simple tunic. He looked at Lark, a flicker of understanding, of a debt paid, in his ancient eyes. Then he collapsed. Chaos erupted. People screamed and scrambled for the doors. Vane's regulators, positioned throughout the hall, drew their weapons, not to keep order, but to seize the opportunity. Their target was the iron box. Lark did not hesitate. As Joe knelt by the fallen Cheyenne, Lark was already moving. He saw the puff of smoke from a second-story window across the plaza, while Vane's men focused on the panic inside. Lark burst through a side door, his movements a fluid blur. He scaled a rain barrel, his hands finding purchase on the rough adobe, and hoisted himself onto the low roof of an adjacent building. He was a hunter now, his grief a cold fire in his veins, his target a sniper on a rooftop. Down in the street, the scene was a maelstrom. Joe saw the regulators converging on the town hall entrance. Intent on grabbing the box, Tom was frozen, staring in horror at the violence he had unleashed. She had to protect the evidence. She sprinted out of the hall, her mind racing. Her Winchester was with her horse, tied a block away. But there were other horses, tied to a hitching post, their reins dropped by fleeing owners. She grabbed the reins of a big roan gelding, swinging herself onto its back with the ease of a lifetime in the saddle. With a wild cry, she spurred the horse forward, not away from the fight, but directly into it. The roan was a powerful, living, battering ram. She charged at the group of regulators, breaking their formation, scattering them like quail. They fired at her, but she was a moving target, weaving the horse through the panicked crowd, circling the entrance to the town hall, a lone cavalry defending a besieged fort. From somewhere in the chaos, a new sound began to rise, deep and resonant, the tolling of a great bell. Nettie Gray, having arrived in Santa Fe by stagecoach that morning, drawn by the telegraph's frantic news of the confrontation, had run to the old mission church on the plaza. With the help of the local priest, she began pulling the thick rope, sending a clear, urgent summons across the city. It was not a fire alarm. It was a call to witness, a call for the community to stand against the injustice unfolding in their midst. The people in the plaza, who had been fleeing, stopped. They turned, bolstered by the bell's steady courage. They began to push back, forming a human wall between the regulators and the hall. Inside, Judge Caldwell stood his ground, his face pale but resolute. He bellowed over the din. In light of this violent attempt to silence a witness, this court recognizes that a state of lawlessness now exists. Instigated by the Copper Star Company, I hereby issue a warrant for the arrest of Silas Vane on suspicion of conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder. Vane laughed, a wild, incredulous sound. Your warrant is meaningless, old man. The law is who has the guns. At that, something in Marshal Wexler finally broke. He had stood by, his soul corroding with every dirty dollar, every compromised piece of procedure, but an assassination attempt in a courtroom, the open declaration that guns were the only law. It was a line he could not cross. His face was a mask of self-loathing and sudden, desperate resolve. Slowly, deliberately, he drew his pistol and turned it not on the crowd, but on Silas Vane. No, Vane, Wexler said, his voice shaking but clear. The law is the law, and you are under arrest. Vane moved with a speed that was terrifying. He did not even seem surprised. He spun, his own pistol already in his hand, and fired point-blank into Wexler's chest. The marshal staggered back, a look of profound shock on his face, and crumpled to the floor. But Wexler's defiance had bought the crucial seconds. On the rooftops, Lark had reached the sniper. The fight was short and brutal, ending with the sniper disarmed and unconscious. Lark's gaze swept the plaza below, taking in the scene Joe's desperate defense, the people's growing resistance, and the chaos at the hall door. He saw Vane, standing over Wexler's body, preparing to make his escape. Revenge was a hot, tempting coal in his throat. It would be so easy to end it, a single shot from above. But he saw Coyote Bill's face in his mind. He heard Judge Caldwell's voice. He felt the weight of Joe's trust. He was not a murderer. He was a protector. He chose justice. He slid down a drainpipe, landing in the alley behind the hall. He emerged just as Vane was backing out. Using the panic as cover, Vane saw him, his face contorting in a snarl of rage. He raised his pistol, but Lark was too fast. He threw himself forward, not with a weapon, but with his body, tackling Vane in a bone-jarring collision. The pistol flew from Vane's hand. They rolled on the dusty ground, a tangle of limbs and fury. Vane was strong, but Lark was fueled by a righteous fire. He subdued the security chief, not with a killing blow, but with a series of precise, disabling strikes. He pinned Vane to the ground, and using a strip of leather torn from his own tunic, he bound his hands tightly behind his back. The fight was over. A warrior had chosen the law over the blood feud, and in doing so, had honored the man who had died for him. The storm of violence in the Santa Fe Plaza passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a landscape of wreckage and revelation. In the aftermath, the gears of a different kind of power began to turn, slow and heavy, but relentless, with Silas Vane in chains and Marshall Wexler, wounded but alive, giving a full, shame-faced confession from a cot in the doctor's office. The foundation of the Copper Star's empire of lies crumbled. The iron box, opened by a skilled blacksmith under the watchful eye of Judge Caldwell, yielded its secrets the original, fraudulent land deeds, Vane's private ledgers detailing bribes to territorial officials, and a comprehensive plan for the forced removal of any who stood in their way. The truth, once a fugitive whisper, was now an official record. News traveled fast along the telegraph wires. A federal investigation was launched from Washington. The Copper Star's board of directors, faced with a public scandal and the freezing of their assets, disavowed Vane and his methods, offering a new plan that relocated their proposed depot 50 miles to the south, far from the contested water. Judge Caldwell, in a landmark territorial ruling, declared the Piha-Katu Spring and its surrounding lands a protected public resource, formally acknowledging its historical significance to the Comanche people. The victory was absolute, but it had been bought at a steep price. They buried Coyote Bill on a low hill overlooking the city, a place where the wind always blew. The ceremony was a thing of quiet, profound beauty, a testament to the alliances forged in the crucible of their fight. A lone Comanche drummer kept a steady, heartbeat rhythm, a prayer to the earth and sky. From the crowd, a group of Mexican women, led by Nettie Gray, sang a soft Catholic hymn for the dead, its gentle melody weaving through the drum beats. There were no priests and no shamans, only people, standing together under the vast, impartial sky, honoring a man who had given his life for a principle. Tom stood beside Joe, his head bowed, the weight of his guilt a visible shroud. He had caused this death as surely as if he had pulled the trigger. After the last of the mourners had departed, leaving only the small group that had seen the struggle through, Tom walked over to Lark. He held out a rolled piece of parchment, the original survey map, the true one, drawn before Vane's corruption had taken hold. "This is yours," Tom said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "It is a poor substitute for the life that was lost. I am sorry, for the water, for the lies, for the pain my cowardice has caused your people. There are no words to undo what I have done." Lark took the map. He looked not at Tom, but at the horizon, toward the distant lands the map represented. "Words cannot replant the grass or bring back the dead," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of generations. "Your sorrow is your own to carry." He then turned his gaze to Tom, and his eyes were not filled with hatred, but with a clear, piercing judgment. "But your actions from this day forward belong to all of us." Joe stepped forward, placing a hand on her brother's arm. She had looked at him during the hearing and seen not a monster, but a weak man who had made a terrible choice out of fear. The love she had for the brother who had taught her to ride and shoot was still there, buried under layers of pain and betrayal. Forgiveness was a complicated, messy thing. "I forgive you, Tom," she said, and she meant it, but forgiving is not forgetting. Atonement is not a word you say, it is a thing you do. She looked from her brother's haunted face to the resolute strength in Lark's. "Judge Caldwell is sending a new survey team to redraw the boundaries according to the original treaty lines. You will go with them. You will show them every false marker you placed. You will work until the last lie is corrected. You will earn your way back with the sweat of your own labor. That is the only apology that will matter." Tom nodded, a flicker of something like relief in his eyes. A path forward, however hard, was better than the endless wilderness of his guilt. He would walk it. The journey back to the Llano Estacado was quiet. The constant, gnawing tension of the chase was gone, replaced by a deep, pervasive weariness. They were no longer fugitives, but they were not the same people who had met by the spring weeks ago. They rode side by side, the silence between them comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. The land itself seemed different. The harsh, unforgiving terrain they had crossed while running for their lives now felt like home, a place of resilience and stark beauty. They were not just passing through it. They had become a part of its story. They arrived at the Piha Katu spring just as the first hint of dawn was touching the eastern sky, painting the clouds in pale shades of rose and gray. The air was cool and clean, smelling of damp earth and cottonwood leaves. The water bubbled up from the ground, clear and constant, indifferent to the struggles of men. It had been here long before them, and it would be here long after. They dismounted and walked to the water's edge, standing together as the sun crested the horizon, spilling golden light across the prairie. The world seemed new, washed clean. "I never thought I would see this place again," Jo said, her voice soft. "I thought I had lost it, lost everything." "You did not lose it," Lark said, his gaze on the rising sun. "You fought for it." She turned to him, the morning light catching in her hair. "We fought for it." The time for unspoken things was over. Their shared journey had burned away everything but the essential truth of what had grown between them. It was a truth as clear and as vital as the water at their feet. "When I was running," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "when I thought I might not live to see another day, the only thing I truly regretted was that I would never get to know you. Not as a partner in a fight, but just as a man." He turned to face her, and the stoic warrior's mask was gone. In his eyes, she saw the same vulnerability, the same quiet certainty that she felt in her own heart. "I have known you my whole life, Josephine," he said, his voice gentle. "I just did not meet you until now." He reached out, his hand tracing the line of her jaw, his touch sending a tremor through her. "My people do not think of love as a cage, as a thing to be owned. We think of it as a path, to be walked together, side by side, but with our own 2 feet on the ground, free." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of a profound and overwhelming sense of coming home. "I am not a woman who can be owned," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I would not want a woman who could be," he replied. He drew her to him then, and she went without hesitation. His arms wrapped around her, and she rested her head against his chest, her own arms circling his waist. It was not a desperate, frantic embrace, but one of solid, grounding comfort. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. They stood there for a long time, holding each other by the life-giving spring as the sun climbed higher, flooding the world with light. They were 2 survivors, 2 warriors, who had found in each other not a prize to be won, but a partner with whom to share the long walk ahead. They had a promise to keep, a vow made not in words, but in the silent, shared language of their hearts, to protect this land, to guard this water, to watch over its people, together. The spring rains had come and gone, leaving the Llano Estacado a changed land. A year had passed, a year of quiet, steady work, and the prairie was reborn. A rolling sea of new green grass that bent and whispered in the wind. The red dust of memory was gone, washed away and settled. The sky was a clean, high blue, and the air was sweet with the scent of damp earth and blooming sage. This was a land of second chances. Jo rode Dusty at an easy canter, her gaze sweeping across the familiar, yet transformed, landscape. She was headed for the Piha Katu spring, which was no longer just a secluded pool shaded by cottonwoods, but the heart of a new kind of community, where there had once been only wild grass. There was now a sturdy, hand-pumped well, a long cattle trough, and a small adobe structure for storing supplies. The spring itself, the sacred water, remained untouched, a quiet reminder of what they had fought for. Near the well stood a large canvas tent, its flaps open to the breeze. This was Nettie Gray's clinic. After the fire, Nettie had used the insurance money not to rebuild her saloon, but to create this, with her knowledge of traditional Kiowa remedies and practical frontier medicine. She served everyone, her quiet competence a bridge between cultures. Joe saw a young rancher's son, his knee freshly bandaged, sitting on a stool beside a Comanche girl who was patiently waiting for Nettie to finish mixing a poultice of herbs for her grandmother. There were no separate waiting areas here. There was only need, and there was only care. A short distance away, under the shade of a newly built ramada, Joe's own work was underway. A small, rowdy group of children, a mix of ranchers' kids and Comanche youth, were practicing tying tourniquets on one another, their laughter echoing in the clear air. Joe sat on an upturned barrel, watching them. After the fight in Santa Fe, she had found a new purpose. The ranch was stable, but her world had grown larger. She had started a small school of sorts, teaching the children of both communities how to ride, how to track, and how to administer first aid. She was not just teaching skills. She was teaching them to rely on each other, to see the person, not the label. Her gaze shifted to a group of riders approaching from the west. It was Lark, leading the spring patrol. The group was small. 4 men, 2 Comanche warriors on their painted ponies, and 2 young cowboys from a neighboring ranch. They moved as one unit, their shared purpose obvious in the easy way they rode together. This patrol was Lark's creation, a joint effort to protect the water and the grazing lands from poachers and predators, a physical embodiment of their hard-won peace. They were the new law in this part of the country, a law based not on silver stars and forged documents, but on mutual respect and a shared love for the land. Lark saw her and broke away from the patrol, guiding his paint horse toward her with a slight pressure of his knees. The limp in his gait was gone, and the wound on his shoulder had healed into a puckered, silvery scar, a permanent reminder of their trial by fire. He dismounted, his smile easy and genuine. The news from the wider world felt like dispatches from a distant, foreign country. They had heard it in pieces, from travelers and old newspapers that Nettie brought from town. Silas Vane's trial had been swift. Marshal Wexler, his career in ruins but his conscience finally clear, had been the prosecution's star witness. His testimony, along with the contents of the iron box, had sealed Vane's fate. The former security chief was now serving a life sentence in a federal prison far to the east. The Copper Star Railroad had new management, a board of chastened men in suits who spoke of corporate responsibility and fair practices. They were still laying track, but their path now bent away from the heart of this land. Progress had not been stopped, but it had been taught a lesson. Joe had a letter from Tom in her saddlebag, its edges softened from being read and reread. He was still with the survey crew, working his way across the territory, correcting the dishonest lines he had been forced to draw. It was hard, thankless work under a brutal sun, but his words were not those of a broken man. He wrote of the satisfaction of driving a stake into the correct place, of the simple, clean feeling of making a wrong thing right. He told her that for every new, accurate map he completed, he signed his full name, Thomas Harper, at the bottom. Each signature was a mark of his atonement, a piece of his honor reclaimed. Lark stopped before her, his presence as comfortable and as necessary as the air she breathed. "The class is over for the day," he asked, his eyes crinkling with warmth as he looked at the squabbling, laughing children. "For today," she said, a smile touching her own lips. "I think they have learned enough about bandages. Tomorrow, we start tracking rabbits." He nodded, his gaze moving from the children to the vast, open prairie that stretched out before them. "Ride with me," he said. It was not a question. They rode out together, leaving the sounds of the small, bustling community behind. They moved across the sea of green grass, the horses' hooves making a soft, rhythmic thud on the damp earth. A herd of wild mustangs, a river of brown and black and white, thundered across a distant ridge, their manes and tails flying in the wind. They were a perfect embodiment of this land untamed, beautiful, and utterly free. They finally stopped under the shade of a lone, ancient cottonwood tree, its leaves rustling like 1,000 tiny voices. They dismounted and stood together, watching the wild horses disappear over the horizon. The peace between them was deep and abiding, a quiet harbor after a long and violent storm. Jo leaned against the rough bark of the tree, looking up at him, a playful glint in her eye. "You know," she said, her voice a low, teasing murmur, "after all this, teaching children and helping Nettie, I am still not what you would call a lady." Lark's smile was slow and warm, a sunrise after a long night. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. "Good," he said, his voice soft but resonant with a truth that had been forged in fire and sealed in trust. "That is precisely what I came for. A partner, not a porcelain doll." He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperate passion, but of quiet certainty. A kiss that tasted of rain and wind and the promise of 1,000 sunrises to come. It was a kiss that sealed not a claim of ownership, but a pact of equals. Two free souls choosing to walk the same path, together, into the long, bright seasons that awaited them. Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to comment with where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.